again. We who believe in freedom and freedom. Come on, say, we who believe in freedom and we who believe in freedom and freedom. We don't believe in freedom. We cannot rest. 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 We will believe. We cannot let me down. We will believe every again. We will believe every again. Say now, we will believe in freedom again. We who believe in freedom cannot rest.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to get started. Folks are coming in. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Darren Mack, go by he, him pronouns, and I'm a co-director at Freedom Agenda, which is a member-led grassroots organization dedicated to organizing people and communities directly impacted by incarceration to achieve decarceration and system transformation. And Freedom Agenda, along with over 200 organizational partners in New York City, leading the campaign to close Rikers. And thank you for joining us on this day, August 31st, 2025, which also marks 2 years from the legal deadline to close Rikers Island. Today is also the last day of Black August, which is a commemoration of freedom fighters originated within the California prison system in the 1970s. And this month of Black August is a month of a lot of actions, a lot of historical issues. Uh, Also, this month is the 62 years anniversary of the March on Washington, and organizations like the National Accident Network actually did a march here in New York City at the African burial ground, beginning right there to Wall Street. And so many things happen this month of August. But I'm excited and honored to seal our week of actions that we did with this webinar and two special guests. So first up, I want to bring on Graham Hodges. He is the George Dorland Langdon Jr. Professor of History and Africana and Latin American Studies at Colgate University. He is the author of many published works and books, including Root and Branch, African Americans in New York and East Jersey, 1613 to 1863. Black New Jersey, 1664 to the present day, and David Ruggles, which we're going to be talking about today. David Ruggles, a radical Black abolitionist and the Underground Railroad in New York City. So, and also we have another special guest, Professor Jonathan Daniel Wells is a professor of history, um, a professor of history in the Department of African American and African Studies, the Department of History, and the Residential College at the University of Michigan. He is the author of many published works and books, including Women Writers and Journalists in the 19th Century South, Blind No More, African American Resistance, Free Soil, Politics, and the Coming of the Civil War. And today's discussion, the book, The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street, Slavery, and Resistance on the Eve of Civil War. So we're going to invite our guests in, um,
And
Professor Wells and Professor Hodges. They could, Professor Hodges, and there go Professor Wells. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Darren. I'm so
it's
glad.
my pleasure. Really an honor to be this here.
Likewise, likewise. And so we're gonna get right into it, get started. For the first question is gonna go to Professor Hodges. And for this question, for those who may not know, who was David Ruggles and what made his activism and organizing work so radical in the 19th century?
Okay. Thank you. Glad to meet all of you people. Uh, right there. I'm going to show a very quick slideshow to help. Is there? Okay. About this is my book, by the way. So for those of you who don't have access to Wikipedia, David Ruggles was born in 1810 and died in 1849, packs an enormous amount into his short life. He's from Connecticut, born of free parents. Um, and he grew up in Bean Hill, outside of Norwich. A lot of neighbors, including Samuel Huntington, who was the first uh, president of the Continental Congress. And he's educated in charity schools taught by people like Lydia Huntley Sigourney, a very famous New Connecticut family. This is a kind of very, if you can read this really fast, this is from a really interesting 19th century racist document, but tells you that David Ruggles was very smart, and he's under the tutelage of a preacher who'd been to Yale College. And so he learned Latin from him. Okay. And he got into a scrape with this guy, uh, with another guy, and was lucky. And I think this is interesting, especially for this audience. So Ruggles was in this close scrape. His partner in alleged crime um, was later put in prison and hung. And this is his death mask. I hope it doesn't trigger too many people. Ruggles eventually moves to New York City, lives near the Five Points, okay, becomes very influenced by radical black abolitionists like Samuel Eli Cornish, who published in the Freedom's Journal. Here's Cornish. Okay, they all read David Walker's Appeal. Nat Turner's Rebellion means a lot to them. And also The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, which starts in 1830. Okay, then also Lewis Tappan's Emancipator. Ruggles is an agent for both of these operations, and which means he goes out well into Pennsylvania and Ohio to sell subscriptions. Very dangerous thing for a black man to do then. Okay, but the other I think is quite fascinating is that he is one of the leaders of a cohort of younger black abolitionists, including Charles B. Ray, this man here, Samuel Ringgold Ward, uh, Henry Highland Garnett, about whom I am now finishing a biography, a really fascinating person. James McCune Smith, who later becomes one of the first black physicians, okay, and Alexander Crummell, who was one of the great philosophers of 19th century American life. So Ruggles is part of this. These people are really interested in education and writing as fighting. And Ruggles argues that you can't really be a black man, unless you are fighting slavery. I think this is something that we should all take to heart here. He writes a lot, so he teaches the power of education, literacy and writing, activism as manliness, community activism either through a church or fugitivity organization. And fugitivity here means planning, flight itself, or importantly, its aftermath, and temperance and cleanliness of body. Okay. He is involved in the 1834 riots. he writes a number of pamphlets. These are some of the first pamphlets written by a black person in America. Here's the abrogation of the Seventh Commandment, which, if you don't remember what it was, says you shall not covet thy neighbor's wife. And it was kind of an attempt to get northern women to shun their southern counterparts who had brothers and husbands and uncles and fathers who were raping black women. Okay. Ruggles then becomes deeply involved, and this is where we get into his radicalism, in the Committee of Vigilance and in fighting enslavement. Okay. And he helps create the Committee of Vigilance. I'm going to stop right there for a second. We're going to come back to the slideshow in a couple of minutes and let him go to Professor Wells.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I was trying to take some notes and
I know I'm going very fast. Usually I
I
a little
learned,
faster, but
yeah, I learned a
all
few.
anxious to hear what Jonathan has to say.
Yeah, and I learned a few things, and that thanks for sharing that. So, Professor Wells, so my question is, can you tell us, who was Richard Riker and what role he played in the group known as the Kidnapping Club in the 19th century New York?
Uh-oh.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for that question, Darren. So I actually learned about Riker through Graham's book, which you saw the cover of, which is a fantastic biography. I would urge everyone to get a hold of it and read it. It's just a remarkable story of a guy that really, deserves to be much better known. Ruggles spent a lot of his time dueling, essentially, in a figurative sense, with Richard Riker, who was the city recorder. And he, unfortunately for Black New Yorkers, was the one that was primarily charged with deciding if somebody was, in fact, a runaway or somebody who was not a runaway. And Riker, of course, hails from a long line of members of Dutch New York. And he is a sort of anti-abolitionist. And that's why he and Ruggles are constantly doing battle. A lot of times what will happen is there are police officers in this group I loosely call the Kidnapping Club. There are lawyers, there are professional slave catchers. And one of the police officers is a guy by the name of Tobias Boudinot, and he is often bringing to Ruggles people that Boudinot claims are runaway slaves. Does Boudinot have proof? Does he really care whether they are born free or self-emancipated? And the truth is, Boudinot does not really put much investment in that. What he's interested in is sending as many Black people into slavery as he possibly can. Unfortunately, again, for Black New Yorkers, Richard Riker is all too willing an accomplice to make that happen. And at the height of the activity of this kidnapping club, and by the way, Ruggles is the one who comes up with that term. He's the one who calls them the kidnapping club. And the thing about Ruggles is, Graham knows this much better than I do, but what amazed me about Ruggles is that he's just absolutely fearless. And he takes to publishing his own newspaper called the Mirror of Liberty, which, folks who are interested, I think they're available online, at least some of the issues for free. And he names names. And he says Tobias Boudinot and his sort of accomplice named Daniel Nash, and he names Richard Riker, and he collectively pins that label on this group. So Riker was pro-South. He was a Democrat, a member of Jackson's party. And as a Jacksonian Democrat, Richard Riker was committed to making sure that the constitutional compromises over slavery were maintained. And part of that was the original fugitive slave clause that was part of the Constitution that obligated northern communities to return runaways. So, his political philosophy as a Jacksonian Democrat, the desire to keep the Union together under this umbrella of the Constitution, dovetailed, unfortunately, quite conveniently with his deeply held racism and sympathy for the South. So he's an arch villain in this story, to be sure.
Mm. Wow, man. Thanks for sharing that. Uh, and yeah, so I want to go to Professor Hodges, and I want to actually read from a page in your book, actually. So this is the book, David Ruggles. Everybody should get it. Folks in the campaign, we actually went to the landmark in New York City in Manhattan, the David Ruggles landmark where his old bookstore was at, and did a vigil there. And that was very for a lot of people that never knew that that place was there. It was really powerful for people to experience that and see that. So, so my next question, I want to give some context about uh David Ruggles' work. So on page 88, it says, in a significant advance of his own activities and one with national ramifications, Ruggles next moved to create an organization to battle kidnappers and to provide practical support for self-emancipated slaves. On November 21st, 1835, Ruggles and other, quote, friends of human rights, unquote, organized the fabled New York Committee of Vigilance, a group had been meeting informally on a weekly basis for more than a year. Its executive committee included William Johnson, Robert Brown, George R. Barker, and J.W. Higgins, as well as Ruggles, who became its secretary. The officers of the group were a mix of blacks and whites and included a restaurant owner, a broker, a grocer, and two career abolitionists. So Ruggles helped found the New York Committee on Vigilance. What was its mission and how did it operate on the ground?
We're going to go back to the slides again. And let's see. Oh, here we are, right here. Okay, share. Bear with me. So, all right. So here's the first report of the New York Committee of Vigilance. Okay. And this is basically, that's Ruggles' handwriting up there. We can talk about that later. Jonathan, Professor Wells alluded to something very important, and that is that Ruggles opens the first black bookstore and first black lending library. And this is really important. And so they sell this book just off Broadway on Lispenard Street. It's a black bookstore selling these kind of revolutionary documents. And it goes back to your original question, Darren, about, how revolutionary was he? Yeah. I mean, this is truly heavy stuff because, as Professor Wells said, he was naming names, okay, and telling people how to do this. So what do? Well, here's the key thing. All right, so this is the era of moral suasion, which for those who are not familiar with this means you try to convince slaveholders to give up their bond people, okay, to obey the Christian rule of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, okay, and says, well, we admire that, okay. We also have to alleviate their suffering, and I want to go down here, and thus in our own individual spheres of action, prove ourselves practical abolitionists. Practical abolitionists, incredible term. That we're not just abstract people. We are doing things that are critically important on the ground. Okay. And that means stopping kidnapping of people of color from the streets of New York City. This is very similar to what's happening right today with immigrants, okay, who are being grabbed off the street, sometimes while they're walking dogs, while they're attending required immigration meetings. This is the same kind of thing, okay, and then subsequently sold into slavery in the southern states, helping what I call self-emancipated slaves and helping them gain freedom in the North. And we're going to come up with a name in a couple of minutes that'll be familiar to everybody in the audience who is one of those people. Okay. And then also important, and we're beginning to realize just how more important this was, stopping the illegal visits of slave traders coming into New York port and freeing slaves held by slave ships. Now, slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade had been abolished in 1808, but it's still happening in a clandestine way. And so that's what practical abolitionism means. Now, added to that, this very important comment, and I want to read this really quickly to you. This again is practical abolitionism. We cannot recommend non-resistance to persons who are denied the protection of equitable law when their liberty is invaded and their lives endangered by avaricious kidnappers. Anyone, when pounced upon by a kidnapper, may not only use words implying resistance, but should resist even unto death.
Mm,
Now think about that because he's speaking to the people. He's
mm,
speaking to the aggrieved families who have lost daughters and sons, to these slave catchers, okay, to these kidnappers that Jonathan so eloquently described a moment ago. Okay, and while moral suasion is a very nice idea, it doesn't work for these kind of people.
mm,
Okay, and so there they are. And so he's recommending, and notice this is a proposal which fails. But this sets the tone for what will be 8 years later Henry Highland Garnett's famous speech to the slaves in Buffalo, New York, in which he urges them to rise up. And ultimately, of course, if you follow this gain here, to all of the big rendition riots of the 1850s, and dare we say, to the Civil War itself. So
mm,
this is a very, very important moment here. Now, this Committee of Vigilance, and here's the Mirror of Liberty. This is his magazine. Okay, is very quickly copied by abolitionists in Philadelphia and in dozens and dozens of other cities across the Northeast within a few years. So this is a network of freedom. Okay? These are what Du Bois called the knots of conspirators who form the Underground Railroad. Okay?
mm,
And so that's what's really important about Ruggles is he's above ground. He is the above ground railroad. He's somebody who's right out there, as Johnson said before, he's right out front about this. This is what I'm doing. I'm proud of it. Consider this. When you look at Frederick Douglass's narrative 8 years later, very famous book, he says, I'm not going to identify most of the people who helped me out, but he puts David Ruggles' name in bold face and says, this guy helped me out. So that's
mm,
not a trick for you. But one of those people that David Ruggles helps out is a fellow who comes to New York and he's scared, he's homeless, he's broke, he doesn't know who to trust. Okay? And David Ruggles takes him in and sends the man who will become Frederick Douglass up to New Bedford to start a career which really reshapes America. So back to you guys.
wow, man. That's an amazing story. Yeah, I never knew that, until I read your book that, David Ruggles actually helped a young Frederick Douglass before he became the Frederick Douglass that we know today. Man,
Yep.
that's powerful. And thank you for sharing that. So to Professor Wells, so my next question, actually, I'm going to read because we talked about a little bit about like Ruggles' paper, The Mirror of Liberty. We talked about The Emancipator, which was another newspaper. Garrison had a paper as well. A lot of newspapers played a role, in supporting or challenging or Richard Riker, the Kidnapping Club, and David Ruggles in this movement. So I want to read from page 123 in your book, Professor Wells. And so yeah, it says the Wall Street press remained concerned that abolitionist agitation would anger the South and further hamper commerce, and they censored abolitionists like Ruggles for placing the interests of Black people over trade, the Constitution, and the Union. Conservative New Yorkers within the business elite realized that, contrary to Governor Marcy's claim that the anti slavery movement was dying, in fact, the crusade was very much alive. White and Black abolitionists were busy making plans, setting up newspapers to promote the cause, and hiring writers and editors. The New York Anti-Slavery Society office had established a prominent presence across from City Hall Park on Nassau Street, and with funding from wealthy benefactors like Arthur Tappan, New York's abolitionists tried to reinforce their movement in case their fears of an attack came to fruition. So, with that context, Nick, Professor Wells, and you can answer the question as well, Professor Hodges. What role did other institutions like newspapers play in either supporting or challenging Richard Riker or the Kidnapping Club or David Ruggles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think to understand what's happening in New York here in the New York City, I mean, in 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, is to sort of jettison what we think we know about the city today, because it was a far different place before the Civil War. In fact, I think you can make the case that New York City is the most pro-slavery, pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And it sort of runs counter to what we think about, certain communities in the North that perhaps were part of the Underground Railroad. I know that it's common to say on this corner, in this house, I discovered, a secret door. It must mean that it was part of the Underground Railroad. And to be sure, there are really crucially important abolitionists in the city, both black and white. And if your listeners are interested, Eric Foner has a great book called Gateway to Freedom. And that was done a few years ago. And then Sarah Groening-Sater has a book that came out last year called The Rising Generation, which is really a smart and well-researched study. And what they tell us is that while there were, in fact, important abolitionists like Ruggles and like Charles B. Ray, like, Arthur Tappan, there were a lot of conservative, reactionary forces in the city. It was a very perilous place to be a black person, and which makes us appreciate Ruggles all the more, because as Graham shows so clearly in his book, it's not just, and he just showed us in the slides, it's not just a verbal attack on slavery, but it's a physical in the streets battle as well. And part of that is because New York City is a bastion of the Democratic Party, which before the Civil War was the party of deeply entrenched racism, and will ultimately, of course, be the party of the Confederacy. And so Riker feels quite at home in this party because he's a member of New York City's conservative army, so to speak. So he's a public official, but there are Irish immigrants from the working class. There are strong voices of anti-abolitionism in the newspaper press. So to your question, right on the eve of the Civil War, there is a weekly newspaper called The Weekly Caucasian, which is published every single week throughout the Civil War and afterwards. And Michael Woods, who's a professor, historian, has got a book coming out about this. But as the name suggests, it was a newspaper in New York City run by native New Yorkers that promoted white supremacy. So, this is what Ruggles is up against. And the Journal of Commerce, which is the Wall Street Journal of its time, is a very conservative newspaper. And the Journal of Commerce wants to support all of these returning of so-called runaways to the South to keep the constitutional compact in place so that they can continue to be prosperous. And New York City makes a tremendous amount of money, not just out of the cotton trade and sort of making sure that cotton bales that are taken to ports in New Orleans or Norfolk or Charleston or wherever make their way to New England and the UK. But there are slave ships that are outfitted in New York City, as Graham just said. There are banking industries that have a stake in the movement of capital and credit that allows the slave trade to prosper surreptitiously. As Graham said, it's illegal, but it still operates. And so what I'm saying is that the city is at war with itself. I mean, you have these extremely powerful forces. On the one hand, minority of New Yorkers like Ruggles and others who believe that slavery is evil. But the vast majority of New Yorkers, particularly white New Yorkers, who either believe that slavery is not really their concern, it's something that exists in the South, we don't have to worry about it, or those white supremacists in the city and conservative economic forces like the Journal of Commerce that say, if we want to continue to prosper, if we want Wall Street to continue to rise to be a global financial capital on a par with London, we have to keep the framework under which our prosperity is developing. And that framework, of course, is the Constitution and its compromises with slavery.
Wow, thank you for that, Professor Hodges, any thoughts about?
Yeah, sure. One of the major issues in American society in the 1830s is the question that all Christians gave to themselves, and that is, can you be a good Christian and own slaves? Okay, and in the South, they said, yeah, you can. You can be a good master, and you can teach your slaves to be obedient, maybe give them a smattering of the scripture. In the North, it's a more viable question, and it splits all of these Northern churches. And most of the denominations, Quakers, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, all have their radical wing, which is very anti-slavery. Okay? And certainly, yes, the newspapers that Professor Wells was talking about are very important, but also are important are the churches, whether they're white churches, and there are a number of those, or the huge number of black churches that had sprouted up since the American Revolution, and they're part of our important American revolutionary heritage. They become free to worship after the revolution, and they do so in size in geometric terms. Okay, and so they are all intrinsically anti-slavery and in some way involved in the Underground Railroad, which again is an illegal activity under that Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that Professor Wells mentioned a few minutes ago. Okay, so that's a really radical thing. And I've been looking at this Henry Highland Garnett. Check him out on the internet if you want to. He's an incredible person. So he's up in Troy, and he's corresponding with Ruggles. And around him are all of these other black abolitionists and black churchmen who are also engaged with Ruggles and with other black radicals who are engaged with people in Pennsylvania with the Purvis family, okay, and receiving people from William Garrett in Wilmington, who have then fled from the Delmarva Peninsula in North Carolina. This is a real migration of people fleeing oppression. And at key stops, and I'm going to go back to that incredible description of Du Bois as these are knots of conspirators. They're going to say, all right, you get up to Wilmington, you get to Philadelphia, okay? Then there'll be some place for you in Jersey, probably around Jersey City usually. Okay. Then you get into New York and there's Ruggles. Okay. And then Ruggles will send you up to New Bedford or to Troy. Okay. Or he might send you over to Durham Logan in Syracuse. Okay. There's all of these people who work together, okay, white and black, to help battle slavery. So it's a religious battle. Okay. It's something which, again, these people, I mean, for them, it was a key question. This is not a small thing. When you die, are you going to be damned because you helped out slavery or owned slaves? Or are you going to be heaven bound because you actually did the right thing? That's salvation. And that's a very deep question. Okay. So I want to, churches, a lot of them acquiesce to slavery. Okay. You see that in the Episcopal Church. They wouldn't do anything for black graduates, like Alexander Crummell refused them admission into their seminaries. Okay. But there are a lot of also others sometimes in surprising places. The Presbyterian Church, which we normally think about as fairly conservative in this era, had a radical wing. And it's headed by a guy named Reverend T.S. Wright, who was the mentor for Ruggles and Henry Highland Garnett, and a whole bunch of other young men, Crummell, and they form a cohort of people who will go in and change the world.
Wow. Yeah.
Darren, can I just say
Go ahead.
quickly, for me, that's where Sarah Groening-Seder's book was a real revelation. The Rising Generation, it's called. And everybody knows to some degree that there was a Quaker presence in Philadelphia, right? We associate with Philly, it's still a visible presence in Pennsylvania today. But she so eloquently and effectively demonstrates the importance of Quaker faith in New York State. So if anybody wants to learn more about what Graham was just talking about, that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, let me add to that the other thing that Groningen emphasizes, and I talked about this in my review of her book in the Crimming Journal of Early Republic, okay, it's so important, is that one thing we did not mention earlier on is that in 1821, blacks had the vote taken away from them, or actually was heavily burdened by a $250 bond. They'd been voting since the Constitution.
Mm,
We're actually a fairly significant political bloc. That's taken away. So all of these guys, Ruggles, and Cornish, Garnett, all of them recognize the importance of politics and gaining the vote, organizing, and these are all, these are basic American tenets. This is the way that our system works. That's what you have to do in order to gain the kind of political power that will give further civil rights. Okay? And Groningen is superb at tracing just how these grassroots organizations came together in New York City, but also in upstate New York. Okay? To again, and just to add on to what Jonathan was saying about New York's racism. It wasn't just the city, it was also the state. Keep in mind that after that vote was removed in 1821, periodically they would have votes to ask whether or not blacks could get the right back. And it was defeated in 1846 and 1861. It was even defeated in 1867. Okay? It was only when at the oncoming of the 15th Amendment that New York finally got its act together.
mm.
So, I mean, this is a place, and this is one of the reasons why, up until the 1990s, there were not a whole lot of black political elected officials, okay, because there really wasn't much power. And it all stems back to this period.
Wow.
But yeah,
Yeah.
Groningen Seder's book is great.
Yeah, I definitely got that written down. And and that makes me think about like right now in New York City, there's a in New York State, people on parole are able to vote and while they're on parole, and in New York City, people who are actually incarcerated on Rikers Island have the right to vote, but there's a campaign called New York City Vote in Jail Coalition that's been trying to make the ballot accessible to people who are currently on Rikers Island. That's like thousands of people, and it's been a challenge with the Board of Elections to like make it more accessible for people to exercise their right. So definitely a correlation to today. So 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 everybody, if anybody just join in, we have Professor Wells and Professor Hodges, talking about David Ruggles, the Kidnapping Club, and I want to, if you have any questions, put it in the Q&A. And before we go to the Q&A from the audience, I'll have like one final question. Actually, I got a couple of questions, but I'll share this question with you, and then we'll see if we have questions from the audience. So I guess we could start off with Professor Wells and then Hodges. So what can you tell us about the role of women in Ruggles organizing networks? Like where were there key allies whose stories we don't often hear?
Yeah, that's a great point. So another book I think people would really find interesting is, well, two books. One is by Leslie Alexander, which really tells a story of the destruction of a very famous neighborhood to make room for Central Park, but also In the Shadow of Slavery by Leslie Harris, which is a book that tells quite a bit about women's experiences. One I'll just quickly mention and then hand it over to Professor Hodges, and that's Henrietta Ray, Charles B. Ray's wife. And they were very active women like Henrietta Ray in supporting the African free schools for children. They were certainly organizing themselves. They had book circles where they had debates and discussed readings. So, I think it's probably not as prominent a role for women as we would like in our modern sense. It was a very sort of male-driven endeavor to engage in these these intellectual and physical battles. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there were very lively, vigorous, strong Black communities. They were really small, right? I mean, on the eve of the Civil War, New York City has like 800,000 people, and only, fewer than 20,000 of them are Black. So we're talking about a tiny population until we get to the 20th century and the Great Migrations. Um, but a part of the responsibility for establishing and maintaining those stable communities was certainly in the hands of Black women.
Couple things. If you're going to help out self-emancipated people like Frederick Douglass, you're going to have to help them out financially. Okay. And famously, if you go back to his narrative, Douglass talks about how David Ruggles gave him a letter of recommendation to go to New Bedford and a $5 bill, which at that time was about a week's wages. Okay, how does he get this? Okay. Well, part of it's some white philanthropists like, Garrett Smith of Peterborough or the Tappan brothers. But a lot of it comes from the contributions that Black women gained in the streets of the city, asking for donations at a penny and nickel a time. Okay? And so Ruggles has this pretty large army of Black women who are going around and buttonholing people on the street. And a lot of them would be hostile for the reasons that Jonathan so eloquently presented. Okay? But some of them, would come across. And so here you have Black women stepping out into roles that are not publicly allowed. And this is a time when women generally were not supposed to be in public roles in the streets. And these women are actually, they're asking for money. And there are about 1,000 of them who are doing this. And they're helping to fund this underground railroad. Okay? So that's kind of that's just how, again, how Ruggles, and this is, I think, is something that's a lesson for everybody out there, it really emphasizes that grassroots organization. The other person, and of course, Jonathan's right to mention Cornelia Ray, is a fascinating figure. Okay, but another person that comes down from Boston, he's kind of driven out of Boston, is a woman named Maria Stewart, and she's one of the very first essayist Black women's poets. Um, and she is as radical as David Walker, who's very quickly, I mentioned his appeal, which is so influential in New York City among Black people in the 1830s. And basically, what it said is that it's going to come down to your battle with slaveholders. Are you going to be killed, or are you going to kill? It's going to be that simple. Okay? Kill or be killed. Okay? And Maria Stewart gives a similar kind of message. Well, she comes down to New York and she's a school teacher for a while. And Garnett and Crummell and Ruggles, well, her book is sold at Ruggles's bookstore. So they can go in there and read that. Okay? That kind of inflammatory document is really a powerful message. Okay? And then Crummell talks about how he and Garnett ran into her and they were really just blown away by this Black woman who is doing such important work. Because, it's pretty much of a male preserve, partly because it's very dangerous. Okay. But it's also because, it's a patriarchal world. But nonetheless, here's this very brave woman. Okay. And she lives a long time. Eventually, she winds up in D.C. and Garnett encounters her again down there. But I mean, she is down there in New York and she's teaching. And by the way, I've learned that to be a Black woman or a Black school teacher in New York City, and there weren't a lot of them, but there were some, was basically a signifier that you were on the Underground Railroad. It was just the same thing. I mean, you were doing this, and those teachers were really radical. So there's another force that we should mention, along with the newspapers and the churches, are these Black schools. I mean, these people, they were doing what Ruggles exhorted them to, which is put their adulthood, their manliness, their womanness on the line to battle slavery.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for that, man. And I have that book written by Kristen Waters, who I actually know, and yeah, now I have to read it.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes, sure.
it's
And Mariah
called.
Stewart is a great figure. I mean, Marilyn Richardson's compilation of her works back in the 1980s is a must read.
Mm.
We're giving these people a big library to work on here, Jonathan. And I. They're all great books.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's always, we spend all of our time reading, so why don't you?
And
yeah.
rereading too. And by the way, this is what Ruggles is big about, folks. And of course, there's no internet then, but anyway.
Mm.
So what do you got here? Any
Yes,
questions from the folks?
yeah. We actually do have a question from the audience, and one of them is, thank you, Arlene, is why name Rikers Island after a pro-slave person? Did he own the island? If so, why keep the name?
Uh,
Anybody think of
you
that?
want to check that, Jonathan? There's a very simple answer to that, right? You want Jonathan?
Go ahead, Graham. You take it.
Well, I mean, the Rikers family owned a lot of what is contemporary Harlem.
Mm,
You know, originally Harlem was a farming community. It was separate from New York. New York doesn't get up that far really until the 1890s. Okay. And so that family owned that land going back to the 1670s. And James Riker was, shall we say, one of the least illustrious of this family. And it's simply been that way ever since. So it's an historic name. But should it be changed? Well, I think there's a good argument for that. Jonathan?
Yeah, absolutely. It should be changed and shut down. They'll have the jail shut down and change the name. I mean, there's no reason to, particularly glorify that family. It's not directly named after Richard Riker. The connection comes, with the long-standing family history in the area of which he was a part. I think there was a long time where I think many of us, well, I'll just speak for myself. I was confused as to whether, in fact, you could really link the name Richard Riker with Rikers Island. And I think for a long time there was some dispute about that. But some genealogical work that was done with the policing podcast, which many of your listeners will be familiar with, Empire City, a great, sort of award-winning podcast series on the history of policing in New York City. So folks should check that out if they don't know about it. But in the process of engaging with that podcast series, there was some genealogical work done to link Richard Riker to the family.
mm,
So I mean, there's no way that Richard Riker is a person who deserves to be memorialized in any way,
yeah.
in our modern sense for sure.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, thank you for the audience for that question. I think we got another question from the audience. It says, what was the name of David Ruggles' library, and is there a book about the history of the library? It seems really significant.
Uh, it was an anti-slavery library. It was in his home at 37 Lisbernard Street. You go there now and get a cup of rather expensive coffee. So it's kind of a one stop. You can go in there and you can run away, be sheltered as Frederick Douglass was for 10 days. You can also read all of this stuff. You can buy the books, although, basically he just wanted to get the message out. Okay, so it's the Anti-Slavery Library. Um, there is a book out right now, and then there's another one coming out, I think, in a couple of months about the importance of Black libraries, and they necessarily have to start with Ruggles. So yeah, I mean, if you go to you know any of the online vendors and put in black bookstores, I think you can find them. There's one that came out this spring, and I'm sorry if I'm blanking on it right now, but there's another one. The woman's been corresponding with me quite a bit. And they do give Ruggles quite a bit of attention. Interestingly enough, and here we're going to get really arcane, a book dealer contacted me last year because a book surfaced with the stamp in it or the signature in it of the Anti-Slavery Library of New York. Okay, and it was scooped up by an institution. And so, they want to know if I knew anything about this, and I told them what I knew. But probably in a year or so after that's been fully cataloged, you can see a book that actually was part of this library. Okay.
Mm,
The other thing too I should mention is that Ruggles gets burned down a couple of times. Arsonists set fire to his library, to his bookstore, his home, and he keeps coming back. Okay. But it's also important to notice that he was, as an activist, and he's really one of the first Black activists. Uh, he was difficult, had a difficult time of it. He was impoverished.
mm,
That's why he eventually had to leave New York because of disease, because he had alienated people, um, because he had no money. It was a hard way to go. He never did any time, but he was definitely economically impoverished, and that was
mm,
not unusual. Uh, Same with Eli Cornish, whose picture I showed you a while ago. He's a very prominent Presbyterian minister, but he's also a cobbler. They don't have any money, these guys. And that's one of the striking differences between them and their white counterparts.
wow. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that was the last question from the audience. So I want to give you both some time to like make some final remarks. But before I do that, I just want to read a page out of the book, The Kidnapping Club, because both of you spoke about libraries and the importance of this history. This is on page 297. Uh, yeah, 297. And it says the glamour of modern Gotham hides a much more somber history on which its impressive influence and cosmopolitanism are founded. Like any city, New York would rather distance itself from the history of racism, slave trading, and kidnapping, but the evidence is there all the same, pervading the paved streets and steel skyscrapers and the very soil of Central Park. As with America itself, the richness and stature New York enjoys today were generated in no small part on the backs of Southern slaves laboring under inhumane conditions to grow cotton. Contemporaries knew exactly where their fortunes came from, which is why they worked so hard to keep the country from dissolving into civil war. Vital institutions like the New York Historical Society and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture strive to keep their memories alive, but they are easy to forget amid the everyday jostling of modern New York. Not all have forgotten, of course. A plaque today marks David Ruggles' home and office on Lispenard Street, and another marker reminds us that the African burial ground had been covered over by countless generations and then forgotten. The beautiful Weeksville Visitor Center in Brooklyn protects the remaining Hunterfly street homes, educating tourists about the once proud and independent community of hundreds of African Americans who cherish their own neighborhood. Uh, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But yeah, just talked about libraries and different, centers in the city. I want to just thank you so much and let you have the last final words to basically close us out.
Go ahead.
Go, Graham, or should I go?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I just think that there's so much more to learn about New York City before this period, despite all these amazing books that we've mentioned. One we didn't even mention was a book that came out pretty much the same time I did in 2020, which was called The Last Slave Ships by John Harris, which is about how New York City continued to be a slave trading port for the transatlantic slave trade long after it was supposedly rendered illegal. So there's just a lot we can learn about. And doing that, engaging in that process of learning, reminds us that the city's history, the United States' history, is just so much more complicated than we often think it is. I mean, it's so easy to fall into this, the Northerners were all of one opinion that slavery was wrong and immoral, and that the South was universally in favor of slavery. I think the latter is probably sort of more demonstrably true. But the story in New York, the story in the states in the Midwest and the Northeast it's just a very complicated one of forces competing for the hearts and minds of the average sort of white citizen. And I say white because, of course, Northern African Americans are fully aware of the injustices and brutality and the violent nature of enslavement. But a lot of white Northerners had to be convinced that there was something at stake in this process for them. And it's in that sort of struggle, in that battle over the course of the 1800s, that I think so many of us as professional historians find a lot to interest us. And I hope that some of your folks will reach out to me. My email is really simple. It's johnwells@umich.edu. And I'm happy to entertain any questions that they might have that they didn't want to ask in the big chat, or some further reading. So thank you everybody for your attention, and thanks Darren for inviting me.
Okay, thank you. Now I want to just echo all of he said and just add to it that what you see in David Ruggles and his cohort are people who are community activists and who are dedicated to it and are willing to sacrifice for the greater cause. And it was a greater cause. I mean, in 1830, no one would have thought that slavery could be overturned. And 35 years later, it was gone. Okay. Yeah, I know that it stayed in various ways, but legally it was gone with the passage of the 13th Amendment. Okay, so that's an incredible human accomplishment. It's an amazing thing. And it's traced back to these kind of people, okay, who were on the ground activists, okay, who linked that up with literacy, temperance, okay, with their concept of manliness. Okay. And they continue to do so. And a lot of those people, by the way, or their children, wind up fighting in the Civil War on the Union side, or the self-emancipated people. Like Frederick Douglass had a number of sons who fight in the Civil War on the Union side. Okay. So it continues past that. Okay. Now, oftentimes it's said history doesn't repeat itself, it simply rhymes. But in fact, and I think Jonathan alluded to this, we have in our society competing thrusts of history. One of them is positive, going towards greater freedom, towards the full fulfillment of the American Revolution and its promises. And there's also that of human oppression. Okay? And Ruggles would not really have been surprised by what's happening right now because these people come back. They wait in the wings for their turn. And so that's what we see, in Trump and Stephen Miller and his ilk. That's where they're at. And their descendants are in people like Richard Riker. Again, it's not that it repeats itself, it's just that they're all part of a continuum. Okay. And the way to battle that, I think, most effectively, of course, is through community activism and then ultimately, and I'm trying to show this in my new book on Garnett, through political action. Okay. And that's the story of what happens in the 1840s and 1850s and ultimately the onset of the Civil War. So my email is ghodges@colgate.edu. Like Jonathan's, very simple, ghodges@colgate.edu. Let me know what you think, and lovely to work with all of you tonight. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Definitely gonna looking forward to that book coming out, and I got a list of books that both of you mentioned that I'm definitely gonna share with our audience. Thank you, Professor Hodges. Thank you, Professor Well, for your time, your work, and your insights. And thanks for the audience, for everybody for participating and your questions. And before we leave, I want to say that actually on Wednesday, September 3rd, at 1 p.m., there's going to be a virtual rally and call to action. For those in New York, probably heard within the last week, 2 people died lost their lives on Rikers Island, and the Hope Solitary Campaign and the Jails Action Coalition organization is going to be holding a virtual rally and a call to action in response to these 2 recent deaths. And you can register online if you go to the Jails Action Coalition Instagram page. If you want to get more involved with Freedom Agenda and the campaign to the Close Rikers, you can go to campaigntocloserikers.org And I hope everybody is enjoying the rest of the summer, this Labor Day weekend. And thank you so much for joining. And thank you so much to the two professors for sharing their knowledge with us.
Thank
Have a
you. Good to talk with you. So long,
Thank you.
everybody. Bye-bye.
good night.
Okay.